Today I want to talk about Fredric Wertham, the seduction of the innocent and the great comic book scare of the 1950s. Wertham blamed comic books for inciting deviant and criminal behavior among kids. What happened? Let's go and find out. Comic books, as we know them, emerged in the 1920s and 1930s. Already in the 1880s, newspapers had started to print comic strips, and a bit later they started to publish full-color Sunday editions solely dedicated to these strips. By the 1920s, publishers started to publish anthologies of comic strips in magazine format. By the 1930s, the format truly came to its own with the appearance of Superman and the rise of the superhero comic book. In the early 1940s, superhero comics were all the rage. In 1943, the US Army bought and distributed over 100,000 Superman comic books a month to overseas US soldiers, calling them vital for the war effort. And by 1945, comic books were selling 80 to 100 million copies a week, an incredible number if we realize that the US population at that time was 135 million. Initially, superhero comics were seen by parents as candy, not altogether wholesome when taken in large quantities, but altogether rather harmless. As an infantile medium, parents rarely bothered to read or inspect the comic books that their children were reading. This, however, changed around 1945. By that time, superhero comic books lost their popularity. After years of war, superhero comics could no longer arouse enthusiasm. Instead, youths drifted towards edgier and darker comic books, focusing on crime, romance and horror. Were these still innocent stories for innocent kids? Many thought not. A glance at comic book covers from the 1950s shows what upset conservative cultural leaders and parents at the time. These covers show scenes of gruesome violence, often against women. We would now rate these kinds of covers as PG-13 or 18, but at the time these comic books were available to any and all who happened to pass by a newsstand with 10 cents in their pockets. Parents grew very afraid of what their children were reading, and this came at a time that US society was afraid of nearly everything. It was a time of McCarthyism, the anti-communist witch hunt, and there were also cases of the Lavender Scare, directed at homosexuals, and of course the Rosenberg trials focused on supposed Jewish communist spies. US society in a Cold War against the Soviet Union was afraid of all sorts of rifts and terror within their midst, and these comic books incited these fears ever more. Enter clinical psychiatrist Fredric Wertham. Frederick Wortham had taken up the plight of underprivileged children. He had spoken out against segregation and co-founded a children's clinic in the borough of Harlem. There he found out that many deviant or criminal kids were reading comic books, and this motivated him to take up the cause against comics. Up to that moment, moral crusaders had argued against comic books, even going so far as to organize public burnings of such comic books. But their arguments had mainly revolved around matters of taste and decency. Fredric Wertham, as an MD, as a psychiatrist, brought the argument against comic books to a new scientific level, and that's where things started to go wrong.
The real question is this: are comic books good or are they not good? If you want to raise a generation that is half stormtroopers and half cannon fodder with a dash of illiteracy, then comic books are good. In fact, they are perfect. Just a very short while ago, an 11-year-old boy committed a holdup in California and killed a woman of 42. And when the police came to arrest this 11-year-old boy, his older brother, who's 20, said, if you want to know the cause of all this, here it is. It's these rotten comic books. Cut them out, and things like this would not happen.
Wertham sought to prove scientifically that there was a causal effect between comic book reading and youth delinquency, and he argued that any and all comic books had a detrimental effect on any and all children. We now know that scientifically speaking, his arguments do not hold up. He did not perform methodological research. He did not work with control groups, and he fudged some of his sources. However, as an MD speaking, his arguments made a real impact. Wertham's arguments had major effects, and in 1954 there was even a televised Senate hearing on youth delinquency and the influence of comics. There, publisher Bill Gaines had to defend this comic book cover. Asked by a senator if the publisher thought that this cover was in good taste, the publisher responded, "Yes sir, I do, for a horror comic." A cover in bad taste would have been a cover with the head just a bit higher so that blood could be seen dripping from the neck.
Some may not like them. That's a matter of personal taste. It would be just as difficult to explain the harmless thrill of a horror story to a Dr. Wortham as it would be to explain the sublimity of love to a frigid old maid. What are we afraid of? Are we afraid of our own children? Do we forget that they are citizens too and entitled to the essential freedom to read? Or do we think our children so evil, so vicious, so simple-minded that it takes but a comic magazine story of murder to set them to murder, of robbery to set them to robbery?
The Senate hearings sealed the fate of comics for decades to come. State laws were installed to regulate the content and distribution of comic books, and the industry decided to regulate itself via the Comics Code Authority. From now on, comic books were forbidden from showing any violence, crime or blood, or any disrespect towards authorities, parents or the sanctity of marriage. Comics that broke these rules could not be distributed and were basically censored. Wertham's Seduction of the Innocent had a lasting effect on the comic book industry. Between 1954 and 1956, half of the comic book titles disappeared from the newsstands, and more than half of the comic book publishers went bankrupt. Hundreds of artists lost their jobs. A broad, diverse and thriving industry had been run aground. Gone were the stories that dealt with more adult themes, such as romance, relationships, crime or the anxieties caused by modern-day life. It would take up until the mid-1970s before comic books would recover, take on again adult themes, and slowly but surely shed the stigma of being an infantile medium. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked this video, don't forget to like, subscribe and ring the bell. And especially ringing the bell is important, because with all these bells I will exchange them for photon torpedoes, which I will then use to conquer the entire galaxy.